black cat, a cool cat. Nobody cool cat, but look out, cause here comes Garfield. He never keeps it, he's too hip. He likes the cat never. Look out, cause here comes Garfield. He's always got the one up on ya. And he'll beat you to the punch every time. You give up anything for lasagna. Unless he has to give up on his next time. But he's a neat cat, a fun cat, just a number one cat. He knows what life is all about. Here comes Garfield. Look out, here comes Garfield. Look out, I said, here comes Garfield. So you better look out. You better look out.
Oh, it's still going.
Have another ride soon.
Awesome. When I was a kid, my dad worked at a place that had a printer, and it was the sort of work environment where you could get away with using the printer occasionally if it was for small things. Now, Dad had grown up in the 1980s, and that was the time where Garfield mania was truly at its peak. And like many Generation X parents, he wanted to pass on to me all of the pop culture phenomenons that he had grown up loving. And it happens to turn out that about a week of Garfield comics fits perfectly on one front and back sheet of paper. So, every few weeks, he would print out a couple pages of Garfield comics, in chronological order. He would bring these home, put them in a binder, and he'd let me read them. So, it came to be that about once a month, I would get to read a couple weeks of 30-year-old newspaper strips about a fat cat who hates Mondays and loves lasagna. This was my favorite thing in the entire world. One day, after a few years of this, Dad came home and told me he had some big news. Because he had been printing out Garfield strips slightly faster than they were being published, he had eventually caught up. That week, I only had one page of Garfield comics to read. The comics from that very week. I remember feeling this odd swell of pride at the mere thought that I had managed to read every Garfield comic that had ever been printed. I wondered for a moment if anyone else on the planet could make such a claim, of being so dedicated or so lucky that they hadn't missed a single panel of the series in its 30-year run. As an adult, my bond with Garfield is sort of complicated. For many years, when I would be around friends and they would joke about how lame he is or how unfunny the comic is, I would laugh along and joke about how silly it is that I used to be so obsessed with the character. But when I go to the thrift store and I see a Garfield plush on the shelf that I've never recognized before, it fills me with a level of euphoria that can only be described as totally authentic. And so, when I sat down earlier this year and decided that I wanted a break from YouTube, and that a vacation or two might be in order, I realized the most on-brand thing to do would be to find a way to have a vacation dedicated entirely to Garfield. Now, if you're looking to plan your very own Garfield vacation, there are a couple interesting options which you might consider looking into. In Idaho, there's a theme park called Silverwood, which has adopted Garfield as its mascot and main walk-around character. Meanwhile, in Pennsylvania, you'll find a completely different seasonal theme park named Kennywood, which features a Splash Mountain-like dark ride named Garfield Never Mind It's Gone. You could swing by Toronto or London, Canada and get a mouthful of Garfield-themed pizza and lasagna, alongside the famed Garfuccino. Or if you're willing to venture even further and wait for traveling overseas to become a good idea again, you could hit up Six Flags China in a couple years, which is prompting to open its own Garfield dark ride, which will feature a series of impressive animatronics recently unveiled at a popular amusement parks convention. But seeking to take a Garfield vacation and choosing any of these options, at least to me, would feel a little bit inauthentic. Garfield is a brand that decidedly has a concrete history and background that one has the chance to explore, and choosing to instead seek out attractions in Canada or China or Idaho would be depriving oneself of the true culture that can be found elsewhere. So instead of doing any of those things, I chose to take a trip to Indiana, the Garfield Holy Land. Now, full disclosure, did I really take this trip entirely to get away from work? Yes and no. In reality, I came here looking for answers about the greatest uncovered pages in Garfield history. Indiana was the place where Jim Davis grew up, where he found his passion as an artist, and I discovered that by looking in the right places, I could discover stories untold about the evolution of his work. So this video is going to be a documentation of this trip I took, and indeed my best guide on how to take a Garfield vacation. But it's also going to have a historical element, and will basically be switching back and forth between discussing previously lost Davis history and showing the many wonders you can discover if you know where to look. Now, there was one group who ended up making this trip ultimately possible, and that was my Patreon supporters. Doing this trip was actually a Patreon stretch goal that we managed to reach quite a while ago. And basically all of the costs of this project I was able to pay because of that secondary support. I don't know if you guys know this, but AdSense is terrible this year. Patreon is also the reason I've been able to afford to put all these nice little animations in the video. So if you want to appreciate all of the unique things we do in this video and you want to see more stuff like that in the future, the biggest way to tell me that is to just pledge $1 or $2. And now, it's time to jump back in time, nearly 75 years. This is gonna get borderline stalkerish. Just roll with it. If you drive to the small community of Fairmount, Indiana, you might spot a sign welcoming you to the town, although sadly, I missed this when I visited. It reads, Fairmount, where cool was born, and features images of the town's two greatest idols, James Dean and Garfield the cat. Fairmount is indeed where James Dean was born and raised, and this has led townsfolk in the last 70 years to seek out archiving and displaying every relic of his upbringing that they can find. Sadly, the same cannot be universally said of Fairmount's other famous alumni, Jim Davis, the creator of Garfield. James Robert Davis was born in 1945, shortly before the end of the Second World War. He was named after his father, James William Davis, who was named after his father, James Garfield Davis, who was named after the assassinated president, James A. Garfield. Although his parents were farmers, he was often sick during his childhood and thus rarely could help out on the homestead. Instead, he developed a passion for drawing, inspired by magazines such as Ripley's Believe It or Not. And while his earliest work was sketchy, to say the least, by the time he had entered Fairmount High School in the 1960s, he had become well known as an advanced student of art, or in other words, the artsy kid. The caption below his photo in his class yearbook aptly predicts,
"If this lad develops his artistic skill, his drawings will take care of any big bill."
Now, Fairmount was a small town and was apparently very invested in the activities of their local high school, which means that the town's adult newspaper had a regular section recapping any and all events in the lives of their students. I literally know what 17-year-old Jim Davis did for his Christmas vacation. This is really weird and a little bit sad, but mostly useful for historical purposes. It's because of all of this that we know that Jim Davis joined his journalism class at the start of his senior year, and began working as an editor on his school newspaper, which was titled The Breeze. But only a few months after he joined the class, he apparently was promoted to a special position on the staff, as this clipping from December 1962 explains.
Jim Davis, advanced art student and member of the journalism class, is going to prepare a cartoon for the remaining breezes this year. The main characters in his cartoon will be Herbie, a freshman. Jim says he is an example of a typical greenie. Herman will represent the seniors. Jim plans to be an art teacher in the future.
That's right. The first ongoing newspaper strip Jim ever created or worked on was something he did for his school newspaper. 5 months after this mystery comic was announced, Jim graduated with honors, and since The Breeze was a weekly newspaper, this means that there were likely just under 20 issues featuring this cartoon. Now, trying to find any of these comics was a daunting task, because the school we're talking about here literally collapsed in on itself almost a decade ago. I contacted numerous people in Fairmount and was eventually able to find out that the town's museum was aware of some collection of these newspapers. From what I understood, these were literally physical copies of the newspapers sitting around in some old boxes. Sadly, to their disappointment and mine, these archives suddenly stopped after the end of the war, meaning that we have 0 issues to show for this discovery. I don't even know what the strip's title is because the article we mentioned before fails to mention it. I'm just going to start calling it Lil Folk. That's not taken, right? Miraculously, though, we still have some material from this series, as Jim was also asked to contribute art to his class's senior yearbook. And it seems like he essentially reused the cast of his comic for this project. This one-panel cartoon, one of 2 appearing below the senior Wills pages, is the earliest comic strip we have created by Jim Davis.
And to my Playboy son, whom I promised to mention in my will, hi there, Gary.
I find the art style used in this yearbook to be odd but interesting, in that it looks more like a Bones fan comic than something created by the guy who would later invent Garfield the cat. Although this brief sketch of a cat sitting on a fence with a flower pot flying towards it is very much something foreshadowing his later work. After Jim Davis graduated from college, he got a job working as an assistant on the comic Tumbleweeds, created by Tom Ryan. Enjoying the job but desperate to create something of his own, he began submitting concepts to various newspapers across Indiana. Against all odds, a single newspaper was impressed enough with Davis's work to hire him. He would contribute art to the letters to the editor page of the small-town newspaper The Pendleton Times, which was pretty irregular considering that these sections are most traditionally reserved for political gags or caricatures. Instead, Jim would create a weekly panel-bound sitcom starring the most relatable of all potential characters: Bugs. Filthy, disgusting, bottom feeder, Bugs. Jim Davis has often talked about NormNat in interviews or in anniversary collections, and it's always been something that stood out to me. Remember, I was the kid who found pride in the idea of having read every Garfield comic on the planet. The idea that there was this whole range of comics that no one had seen for decades, it fascinated and pissed me off in equal amounts, even from the youngest of ages. But things took a turn for the more extreme last year, when, while trying to find copies of any NormNat comics I could for a short film I was making, a librarian in Pendleton revealed to me a second comic series Jim had created which I had never heard of. Titled simply John, the series began in 1976 and featured prototype versions of all of the Garfield cast, all written and drawn in ways that I had never seen before. I had told myself 10 or 15 years ago that I had read every Garfield comic ever published, and years later I was finding out that Jim Davis had turned me into a liar. This was the deciding factor that made this trip inevitable. I had to set things right. I had to find the lost Jim Davis collection, and I had to do it while convincing myself that it wasn't work because I was definitely supposed to be on vacation at this point. And thus, with the full backing and inspiration of my glorious Patreon supporters, I took the voyage to the small town of Pendleton, Indiana. Pendleton, I want to say, is a really cool place. I went in fully expecting it to be abandoned and run down, the kind of place that might remarket itself as the birthplace of Garfield. No offense, Fairmount. But instead, it was a pretty comfortably developed community. It looked and felt just like my hometown, except when I went into a coffee shop, there were a lot of people inside, which was a good thing back in January. After a couple days, I started to feel like I could move here, settle down, and then wait to die in a rocking chair or something. Even the library, while smaller than the ones I am used to, was just cozy enough to relax in. After entering, I quickly met up with the librarian who had helped me find the few comics we had uncovered in 2019. In the original video, I didn't give her, any credit, really. And the reason I did this is because I was really worried that if I even said her profession out loud, Garfield fans around the world would start harassing her en masse, trying to get her to release the rest of the lost comics. Archiving these comics is very tedious and long work, and I didn't want her to get flooded with fans asking her to do said work for them. But it should be clarified that if it wasn't for her and America's beautiful network of libraries, none of this would have ever happened. Thanks to Indiana's archival program of the 1980s, the Pendleton Community Library owns copies of almost every issue of their local newspaper dating back to the early 1900s, all saved on microfilm. Microfilm is a little bit of an outdated technology. It's not a sexy way of looking through these newspapers, but it had a lot of positives in the end. Being able to mess with the film reader myself meant that I could expand the resolution as much as I wanted, and because of that, I immediately started printing the comics to fit the entire page. And thus, I sat like this for almost 2 days, scanning every comic I could, and checking dozens of times through every issue to make sure that not a single dot of ink was missing from my printed out collection. There were a couple big issues that came about while I was doing this, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. The most exciting thing about this whole project was finally getting a good sense of the true nature of the Lost Norm Nat series. As we've discussed, Dad and I grew up loving Garfield and being obsessed with the work of Jim Davis. And it dawned on us that we were reading these comics that no one outside of Paws Incorporated had seen in 3 or 4 decades. The oldest Norm Nat comic seen here was printed just over 47 years ago. It's insane for me to imagine that any creation of Jim Davis is even close to 5 decades old. Here's one of my personal favorite comics from the run.
What's your special today?
Try our hamburger surprise.
This tastes like dirt.
Surprise!
Now, the first thing most people are going to be inevitably looking for when reading Norm Nat is all the subtle ways it went on to influence Garfield. The most obvious sign of this can be found in the names that keep popping up all over the run. Most obviously, Lyman, Norman's bumbling best friend, would later be reincarnated into Lyman, John's bumbling best friend. Incidentally, I was shocked to discover in my myriad research that Lyman was a real dude. Apparently, Jim's best friend in college was someone named Lyman Kirchhoff Jr., who helped him run political campaigns on campus and by some accounts was his roommate. The various Lyman aside, as I read through each of these missing comics, I found some of the lesser-known connections to be more surprising and shocking. Here's live footage of me discovering one of the most obvious ones. So this is a comic from April the 5th, 1973. This is the Norm Nat prototype comic series that eventually sort of evolved into Garfield. And we have a character here referencing the anthology of poet John Arbuckle. It's so surreal. I guess Jim Davis just had that name like on backlog, and it's so. Okay, so I get pretty excited in this clip, and I sort of start blabbering. But as overzealous as I was, it wasn't until later in my research that I realized that this comic represents a lot more than just a reused name, because it also additionally implies somewhat of an extended universe. You see, one of the most notable things about the Norm Nat comic is that a high amount of the strips were actually reincarnated later on. The gags rewritten to better fit the projects that Jim created after Norm Nat proved to be a failure. For instance, here's a comic from February the 21st, 1974. In it, Cecil the Slug zooms past Norm and explains that he has new treads that allow him to go fast. It's a pretty good bit for a comic about bugs. But when Jim later created John/Garfield for the Times, he reworked the strip into being about Lyman having good shoes. This was printed on February the 9th, 1978 in the Pendleton Times before being workshopped one last time for the syndicated Garfield run on November the 11th, 1978. By this point, Jim was so obsessed with recycling the comic that he chose to ignore that the joke doesn't even make sense anymore. The point is that this Norm Nat comic, which mentions John Arbuckle as a poet, is notable because it was later recycled into a comic where John writes and then reads that very poem that was shown in the original comic. This seems to outright confirm that Norm Nat and Garfield exist in the same expanded universe, with John writing the poem in Garfield and a character then reading the same poem and attributing it to John, although John's name in the two runs is actually spelled differently. Another comic from the next year does a similar bit of foreshadowing.
Hi, Lyman. Where you headed?
I'm hoofing it down to the Bijou to see their new Stag movie.
Stag movie? Oh, my.
Yeah, you see, the star of the movie runs around with no clothes on, which is okay because he lives in the woods.
Good heavens. What's the name of the movie?
Garfield, Stag of the North.
NormNet has a lot of eccentricities in the stories that it tells, given that it has a completely different format to Jim's other work. For instance, an ongoing gag in the strip's first year was that Norm was continuously simping for a slug woman who looks like this.
Here comes Natasha. I've got to do something really masculine to impress her.
Hi, Norm.
The beach is that way.
I'd like to stand and chat, but I gotta go beat up on a bully and do some push-ups. Face it, Norm, you may look like Douglas Fairbanks, but you have the heart of Broderick Crawford. Hither approaches Natasha. Old Norm baby has memorized a love sonnet. I'll work it into her conversation and sweep her right off her feet.
Hi, Norm.
By golly, she sure do look like rain.
Natasha is one of only 2 female characters in the NormNat series, and Hi Norm is the only line of dialogue she is ever given. I think one key thing comes to define NormNat, especially in later stories, and that is the strip's ongoing frustration with its own lack of success. In one arc from late 1973, Norm begins to comment on the fact that despite the fact that the comic is named after him, he never, quote, gets the punchline, leading him to attempt to become a stand-up comedian to prove that he is indeed funny.
It's time I started earning my own way in this strip. I'm gonna become a stand-up comedian.
You are halfway there already.
How's that?
You are standing up.
I've already been booked for a one-night stand at the Roach and 4.
For how much?
$26.50.
Where did you get that kind of money?
For being the fall guy for a nothing nobody sawed-off wimp in a comic strip whose name I can't even remember. I'm only going to do that last take once.
This attempt at professional comedy leads to Norm bombing every night and constantly being caned off screen. This is clearly one of the main inspirations for the fence strips commonly seen in Garfield. But my favorite out of all these strips is from November 8th, 1973, when Jim makes commentary on boomer generational humor, which was far ahead of its time.
And this guy says, I haven't had a bite in 3 days. So, I bit him. So that's what I did. Yeah, boy. I bit him.
Take my wife, please! It really seems like Jim was actually convinced that one of the reasons that his comic wasn't being picked up was that it lacked the typical I hate my wife male boomer humor. Because not only does he use this strip to mock said standard, but in following months he caves and introduces a character who exists exclusively to fill this role.
Hi, Drac.
Save the niceties. This is my wife, Vench. She wants to be in your strip.
As I see it, I could lend this tacky strip a little class. How do you feel about me being a sex symbol?
Well, I'm
Dry, repulsed, and nauseated for starters.
This is Norm Nat's other female character.
You don't love me anymore, do you?
That's assuming I ever loved you.
Why?
Take a peek in the mirror sometime, vampire face. Your looks would scare the fuzz off a fooly worm. Sometimes I wonder after all these years how I've managed to maintain my warm sense of humor.
My favorite unique thing this comic does is that it actually features Jim Davis himself as one of the recurring characters. Norm is often seen speaking into the sky at Jim, and this usually ends with Jim threatening to erase him with an oversized pencil if he ever steps out of line. It's fitting that the real Jim Davis has claimed for decades that he killed Norm off despite this not being the case, because it's clear in the narrative that Jim has been trying to do this for several years. Norm Nat is one of those things that I can barely bring myself to judge. To me, it's not good, it's not bad, it just is. It's a really interesting series to read through, not just because of what it came before, but also because of the incredible detail and creativity that was clearly put into so much of it. Even if it didn't always work perfectly, you can tell that there's a lot of love put into every single panel. Here's a fun anecdote about this strip I think you guys will like. When we found all of these comics last year, one of the first things that my librarian friend did was write a letter to Paws Incorporated asking if they had a better scan of the final strip, where Norm waves goodbye to the audience and thanks them for everything. She argued that it might be nice for the community to have something like that on display. Jim quickly wrote back, saying that they did not have such a thing to send, but he instead sent back a hand-drawn recreation, now featuring Garfield as drawn by Jim himself. And that drawing now hangs behind the front desk of the library, as a lasting representation of the importance that Pendleton had to the development of the Garfield comic. She also gave me a copy, which I promptly hung on my set because it's pretty damn cool. So the next page in the history of Jim's work is obviously the moment that he created Garfield the cat. And we're going to get into that in a tiny little bit. But first, I want to talk about the lasting impact Garfield has had on the state of Indiana, by discussing the few odd touristy things you can do if you happen to be in the area.
That's probably it right there.
Look at that! Oh!
This is like some kind of thing. This is the way in. I'll just park right here. Alright, I'm going the wrong way.
Yeah, so you might be asking, what's the significance of Muncie, Indiana? Why is it one of the places that all this Garfield stuff exists? Well, Muncie is where you can find Ball State, the college where Jim Davis went to college. And Jim Davis loved it so much he decided he wanted to live here or around here. So Paws Incorporated operates either out of Muncie or near Muncie, and the Garfield comics are intended to be set within the Muncie city with a car. So Muncie is supposed to be literally the place where Garfield is set. And that is one of the reasons which it has ended up just adopting Garfield as its mascot to try and bring tourists in. The town that I'm from is, it's big about horses. Everyone loves horses there. You go on a street and there's like a 1 in 10 chance that the street is named after a dead horse. It's that kind of place. And it's surreal going to Muncie because it feels like the exact same place, except it's obsessed with Garfield instead of horses.
There's a statue.
There it is.
Hi.
Oh, hi. Sorry, I hope we're not disturbing.
Oh, no, you're not.
Oh. And they're all signed by Jim Davis,
Yes.
right? Oh, this is so cool.
We also have a ride.
Oh, you guys have one of those too?
Yeah.
So the Muncie Visitors Bureau is a quaint little establishment that attempts to encourage people to travel there for tourism. One of the ways it accomplishes this is by being one of the most concentrated sellers of Garfield merchandise. Now, where did they get all of this insane merch, you might find yourself asking? Well, only a few months before I came to Indiana, Paws Incorporated closed its headquarters down and put the building up for sale. I happened to visit during this brief period where it hadn't been sold yet, so I felt somewhat comfortable stopping by and vlogging a little bit. And from 1989 to, let's say, November 2019, pretty much every Garfield comic that you guys know and love were made inside this building. The official story of what happened is that as Garfield went fully digital around 2011, there was no reason that everyone on the staff couldn't just work from home. Having an art studio just for making Garfield made sense when the place opened in 1990, but by 2019, it had become an outdated money sink. But I also think that the main reason that the headquarters closed down was the recent buyout by Nickelodeon. In past years, when Paws was trying to broker new merchandising deals, they would often fly people into Indiana to take them to this building, where they would be shown rooms filled to the brim with Garfield plushies, teacups, and books, and often this would help seal the deal.
This is where we meet with all of the licensees. We work visually. All of our walls are bulletin boards. And when we have agents come in from other countries, we could talk all day but never see the same thing, but they can go to a shelf, pick a product up, and say, do this in green, and we can sell this.
But as Nickelodeon now owns the rights to Garfield, tasks like that exist outside of Paws' worry or jurisdiction. There's just no reason to have rooms dedicated to exemplifying how merchandise-friendly Garfield is, because they're just going to gather dust. As I traveled around Muncie, I heard stories from many small businesses that they were all given early access to tour the closing Paws building and claim any merch that they wanted. This is how the Visitors Bureau is able to sell merch which is decades old, yet in pristine condition, because it all used to hang in the hallowed halls of Paws Incorporated as mere decoration. We were told before we left that we just had to stop and go to the back office to meet Executive Director Jim Mansfield, and to see some of the rarest Garfield collectibles of all time. Jim owned not only a personal autograph from Jim Davis, but such rare artifacts as a signed print of the famous 25th anniversary comic, alongside the original April 1978 article from the Muncie Star, which previewed the comic months before it went to print. Finally, I had found my intellectual equal, a man of culture, a man of true taste. I was very curious about how Muncie had subtly adapted this strange identity, based around drawing tourists in with a cartoon cat, and it seemed Jim had all of the answers. In 2003, Garfield turned 25 years old. This was probably the biggest time for Garfield as a brand. His birthday was celebrated all over the world, and production had recently begun on a live-action film which would star Bill Murray as the Fat Cat. To celebrate, Muncie held a massive celebration dedicated to Garfield and Jim Davis.
It started on Thursday, which was actually his birthday.
Oh.
You probably already have one of these, buddy.
Oh no.
Started on a Thursday. We actually had a big birthday party out at Minnetrista, which is one of the local attractions. And then on Friday, all the Garfield collectors were here. There were about 400 of them.
Wow.
And they took over our convention center and was selling things and whatnot. Friday night, we had a dance that was called the Fur Ball. And so, of course, Jim and Jill were the celebrities to that whole thing. And then on Saturday, we actually had a parade downtown, and we got the Garfield blimp from the Macy's parade, along with a whole bunch of other stuff. So it was just 3 full days of a lot of fun and activity, and Garfield swept the community.
It was in the midst of this celebration that Muncie unveiled a collection of statues customized by local artists, which were put on display all around town. In 2003, there were 25 of these statues in existence, the first of which being a generic statue of Garfield featured at the Muncie Visitors Bureau. Sadly, only 15 of these are still on display today, most either being put into storage or sold to private collectors. At the Muncie Imaging Center, we found This Cat Has 9 Lives, a breast cancer awareness Garfield. Next to him sits a sign which reads, "This cat has 9 lives. You don't, so get a mammogram." At City Hall, in an obscure nook of the building, sits Garth Brooks. As we'll see later, statues being this perfectly intact with props and decorations still in place is rare with this collection. At the American Red Cross rests a dedication to Clara Barton, featuring Garfield as a nurse. From what I can tell, this isn't the original statue unveiled in 2003. That, or it's been very hastily customized. I think there's something sort of funny about how shabby the current statue looks. If you can't tell, the American flag is being held on with packing tape. We next stopped in at Jack's camera shop, where we actually got to meet Jack himself. Jack told us that Jim Davis had actually stopped by the shop the week before and had re-signed the statue. As Jack explained, the gimmick of his statue is that it's actually a working camera.
So Garfield is a pinhole camera.
Oh, I see.
So there's a pinhole in his nose. So a little hole in his nose. And then in the back is a receiver for Polaroid 4x5 film.
Oh.
So you put him outside on a nice bright day, and 20 minutes later you'd have enough light on the film to...
One of the strangest experiences we had was at the Muncie Children's Museum, which we instantly noticed had a Garfield coat room right by the entrance. However, when we spoke to the woman at the front desk, we were given very odd instructions. We were told to leave the museum, go down a flight of stairs next to the lobby, and to then stop right outside of the museum's storage facilities. This is where we found the statue, sitting in a damp, unlit corner, which actually seems to match its coal miner theming. This is the perfect setup for the Muncie Center of the Arts, where we found Yo-Yo Pa and Puglacey. In every place we visited, there seemed to be some local who had something to say about these statues. And here, an employee explained to us that because these two statues had been around hyperactive, playful children for 17 years, they had lost most of their defining aspects.
They used to be a lot more decorated, but we're a center for the arts with kids. And they just beat the crap out of them. This one had a really neat little tutu on because he's Pagliacci the clown. Mm-hmm. And he had a clown hat and stuff, and all that's gone now. The other one is Yo-Yo Pa. And he doesn't have his glasses or his violin anymore.
Oh, okay.
And he used to have all that stuff too, which I get it. That's great.
While we were there, the employee insisted that we had to be shown the uppermost floor. Unsure of what he wanted to show us, we followed him blindly until the situation was suddenly illuminated for us.
This was the Blue Lodge room where the men met.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's gorgeous. This is something you'd expect to see in D.C. Now, why isn't the Garfield statue in this room?
At the local county building, we found Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Smoke-Free Air, which is a very 2003 title to a very 2003 statue. This Garfield supports American interventionism in the Middle East. We next arrived at the orchard shop at Minnetristo, which was closed for renovation. However, when the owner saw us out front, she dragged the statue out to the warehouse portion of the building so we could take a photo with it. People in the Midwest are very nice. At the local animal rescue, we found Saving Lives is the Cat's Pajamas, which had been sitting outside for 17 years and showed a little bit of weathering, but was still a very charming piece. Next, at an active daycare, we found Literacy and Lasagna, which features a hidden quote on the back that reads, "Literacy is like lasagna. Delicious." And, in my personal favorite statue, at United Way in the Star Building, we found Reflections of Our Community, a disco ball Garfield which has remained in perfect condition over the years. We met an employee there and had a long conversation about the closure of Paws Incorporated and the effect it's had on the community. Finally, our last two statues were found at the famous Ball State University. At the Ball State bookstore, the map told us we would find modern art Garfield, but instead we found a different statue which is intended to be a tribute to Indiana legend Carl Erskine, a former pitcher and lifelong supporter of the Special Olympics. I didn't understand this context at the time and just presumed that it was supposed to be a superhero, which I guess it kind of is. After this, we were supposed to go to the Ball State Alumni Center. This is where things got confusing. Throughout the whole day, we had been relying on people at front desks and employees for directions. So when we walked into the building that we thought was the Alumni Center, we went straight for the front desk. However, a FedEx guy had gone in just a few seconds before us, and it turned out that he and the front desk lady actually knew each other. So we're waiting for him to finish dropping this package off so we can ask for directions, and then, all of a sudden, the FedEx guy loudly announces, "Guess what? Me and Marcia are having a baby!" What followed was a straight minute of hugging, and then a 15-minute conversation about daycares and birthing plans and doctors and baby showers, and there was a 0% chance that I was gonna interrupt all that just to be like, "Excuse me, I'm a Garfield historian?" So instead, Dad and I wandered around this goddamn building for the longest time, and there were no Garfield statues. There were a lot of sweaty guys working out really intensely. Turns out that was the football center. Those were all football players training rigorously for a season that never happened. But once we found the actual Alumni Center, we knew we were in the right place. And of course, it was there that we found the Graduate, the final statue in Muncie that we had left to see. After we were done in Muncie, we did what is called the Grant County Garfield Trail. This is sort of a ripoff of what Muncie did, but done across an entire county instead of just one town, and featuring a much higher budget. Each statue is a different mold, and your general road trip tourist will find these much more interesting. They're also mostly outside, making them much more accessible.
The camera's gonna die. Look at that ice cream Garf.
I feel like I've bored you guys with this section, so let's go through the rest of these really quickly. Pause for Thought in Marion, Indiana. Cool Cat in Fairmount, Indiana. Gone Fishing Garfield in Matthews, Indiana. Scream for Ice Cream in Upland, Indiana. A Worldly Cat at the Van Buren Public Library. Glassblower Garfield in Gas City, Indiana. British Soldier Garfield in Gas City, Indiana. Firefighter Garfield in Jonesboro, Indiana. Dr. Garfield in Marion, Indiana. Fit for Life Garfield in Marion, Indiana. Bookworm Garfield at the Marion Public Library and Museum. College-bound Garfield in Sweetser, Indiana, and Speed King Garfield in Swayze, Indiana. Would you believe that there are Garfield statues in Indiana that I missed somehow? There's a golf-themed Garfield carved out of wood which is featured at a golf club that was closed by the time we got there. And there are 2 statues of Garfield and Odie outside of the Indiana Farmers Coliseum. I'm starting to think every Indiana business secretly has their own Garfield statue, and they're just really badly documented. Okay, with the biggest of biggest tangents out of the way, let's jump back into figuring out the lost history of this iconic orange cat, as we talk about the myriad issues I found when trying to archive his lost adventures. Okay, so Pendleton was a fantastic place to visit, and the library was so great and was essential to this restoration project being a reality. However, I quickly realized that there were faults to going through these comics the way that I was. The most obvious being that this process included variables which could lead to whole extra layers of quality loss. I was printing these comics out of an old machine, sometimes fidgeting with the toner levels to try and perfect the line art quality, And then when I got home, I scanned these printed out pages into my laptop. Think of it like this. Imagine if the Garfield comics my dad printed out from his work computer were the only copies that existed of those strips today. Obviously, this couldn't be the most ideal way to save these strips. The straw that broke the camel's back for me was the final year of NormNat Comics. Now, for those of you who saw the original video I did, you might remember that many of the comics I showed featured lines going through the artwork, which I presumed to just be a side effect of the microfilm process. However, I was shocked to discover when actually scrolling through the 1975 reel that said lines passed in between every single page, obviously indicating that what I was looking at was damage on the microfilm, which must have occurred in the 30 years since the reel was made. This was so bad in some issues that comics like this one proved to be impossible to restore or even read. The additional detail that one issue of the John comic was entirely missing led to the conclusion that we needed to dig a little bit deeper. And so we traveled to the glorious city of Indianapolis. Visiting Indianapolis, first of all, meant that we could also stop by Garfield Park, where I held a small meetup, which actually turned out to be pretty big considering everything. It was here that I discovered that my core demographic is apparently girls with pink hair. This person brought me fan art of Garfield as Mecha. They called it Mecha Garfa. I will treasure this until the day I die. Anyways, eventually we made it to the Indiana State Library, which, we discovered, owns a massive archive of almost every newspaper in the state that you could ever want to read. Upon arrival, we learned 3 facts that completely changed the restoration process and basically led to me starting from scratch with the project. The first, that the library's copies of the Pendleton Times were in such good condition that the microfilm reels could have been printed yesterday. The second, that many of the reels featured addendums which included better scans of numerous issues and the missing comic that wasn't at the Pendleton Times.
It's not even funny.
And the third, that the Indiana State Library has a series of digital scanners free to use which allowed me to scan the comics and save them digitally to a flash drive. For reference, here is a comic that I was sent by the librarian in 2019. Here is the copy I printed out myself in Pendleton. And finally, here is the digital scan I made at the Indiana State Library. To me, this is the difference between having a VHS copy of a lost movie and having the official Blu-ray release. This was the day before we were supposed to leave, and I was quickly realizing that I owed it to all of you to get the best copies of these comics that I could. So the morning that we were supposed to be driving home, I came back to the library at 9 a.m. and tried my best to save 5 years of comics history in the 7 hours before the library closed. While I was doing this, Dad ended up wandering around the library and looking around at all the exhibits. In doing this wandering, he eventually discovered something quite funny to us. About 100 steps from where we were working sat a small children's exhibit dedicated to Indiana writers. The main features being Garfield and Clifford the Big Red Dog. A whole 1-minute walk from where this unknown archive of Garfield history had been kept for decades, we could stop and visit a historical depiction of Garfield's origins which ignored those very archives completely. And right outside of this sat yet another Garfield statue. This is actually the best Garfield statue I saw because it's the only one that's roughly to scale. If Garfield was real and we hung out, this is what we would look like. But even more interestingly, right next to all of that was another small Indiana-based exhibit which featured a collection of vintage Garfield collectibles. And among that group was a piece of paper which described the history of the Garfield comic. That description included details which were not generally known until I made my video last year. It was really surreal to think that my video had caused such an impact that Garfield's history had literally been rewritten in a museum. I've never taken these dumb videos to have that kind of importance or outreach, and this made me really motivated to keep this project going. Anyways, we're pretty damn deep into this video at this point. I've probably wasted about 40 minutes of your time by now, so let's finally do what we all came here to accomplish. Ladies and gentlemen, I present the pipe strip. When looking through this prototype series, which would eventually be reincarnated into the most famous comic strip of all time, it's funny to look at all the odd details which mark a stylistic difference between the two runs. One of the most notable things about Garfield, so notable that the Wikipedia page mentions it in the opening intro, is that the strips mostly seek to exist in a vacuum outside of current events, politics, or pop culture. That's why it was possible for a kid being raised around the turn of the millennium to read comics from 1978 without feeling like they were dated in any noticeable way. But it's clear from reading Normnat and John that this was a lesson that Jim hadn't quite picked up on yet.
This is it. Here comes the judge's decisions. She won! She won!
The next time I see Dorothy Hamill, I'll scratch her eyes out.
Garfield, I don't know who that is. Many of these strips are based around Jim putting in references to things that he has seen on TV and movies he's seen and stuff like that. John and Garfield fawn over Farrah Fawcett and Annette Funicello, women who are dead and have been dead for years. And some of these comics definitely happen to age a lot less well than others.
These Olympics are great.
I'm hungry.
Looks like they're holding up the 100-meter dash, folks. Up until John Arbuckle feeds his cat Garfield.
Thanks, OJ.
Yes, this is indeed a comic which implies that 1976 Olympics commentator O.J. Simpson and Garfield the cat are secretly best friends. Here's an unrelated comic where Garfield pleads the fifth. The most important thing about these comics to me is the artistic style presented and the evolution of the characters. As we discussed last time, the character we know as Odie was named Spot in the original run, and had a totally different appearance. Lyman has a bit more of a focal role in the comics, and John has been given a physician literally copied and pasted from the Norm Nat series, except made human. I did discover that Pookie is another character who had a different name, being called Huggy in the Pendleton run, but that fact is really boring, especially when compared to another character's evolution. On February the 26th, 1976, John visits his local laundromat where he suddenly spots a woman he's never seen before. Hoping to make a great first encounter, he throws his best one-liner.
Nothing like a cute one-liner to meet a new chick. Haven't we met somewhere before? A rice paddy in Hong Kong?
The laundromat woman then becomes cursed, with John continuously trying to court her, every time to pathetic failure. She would become known to both John and us as simply that girl. But things change in September of that same year, when that girl appears again, but with a slightly different appearance.
There's that girl again. Call me John.
Call me repulsed.
Over the course of the next year of comics, John continues to run into this briefly unnamed woman, and while it's sometimes written as if they're simply crossing paths by coincidence, other comics make it seem like John is actively seeking these moments out. In one terrifying comic from September 1976, John seems to be hiding in an alley, waiting for that girl to walk by. He then jumps out of the alley to surprise her, only to see that she is with a much larger man, waiting to confront him. You can take your guess on if this is her boyfriend, or if Proto-John's incessant stalking has become so deranged that she's asked a platonic friend to chaperone her around. It should be quickly pointed out that, obviously, the comic was hardly trying to condone John's actions. Jim Davis was a married man who had settled down in a small town to start a family. He wasn't living the bachelor lifestyle that John tends to in these strips. But more importantly, John's exploits with women in the Garfield comics have always ended with him being presented as a pathetic husk of a man, as if ultimate public embarrassment is what he deserves for acting like this. But the obvious response to this point is the fact that John is still our protagonist, literally, to the extent that the comic was named after him at this stage and Garfield was never seen outside of the house. And when you present your protagonist as an obsessive stalker and womanizer, it makes it a little hard to keep following the story. I guess you could say that John and Norm Nat have the same basic problem. The comic's protagonists are horrifying monsters. And I think Jim himself began to see this as a problem and started to try and figure out how to iron out this wrinkle. And this, in a shocking revelation, seems to be the very reason that Irma's Diner came into existence. Irma first appeared on January the 27th, 1977. She appears again 2 weeks later, but it's her third appearance that reveals to us the real purpose in introducing the setting of her workplace. I couldn't get in contact with Sarah Z, so I'll have to do the voice of Irma this time.
Guess what, hon? We have a new girl working here.
Oh. I think I just died and went to heaven.
Liz's first job in the Garfield comic was as a waitress at Irma's Diner. In the final year of strips after this, the two will be seen crossing paths exclusively under this context, including numerous comics which would later be reworked into the syndicated Garfield run.
What's your name?
Liz.
Gee, what a pretty name. Is that short for Elizabeth?
No, it's short for lizard.
I don't think Liz likes small talk. How about a date, Liz?
Could you make it through the night if I said no?
Yeah.
No.
Face it, John, snappy comebacks aren't your forte.
Once again, I can see myself getting into Jim's head at this point. Sure, John isn't literally stalking Liz down alleys anymore, so it's not as creepy. But the relationship they represent still feels a little bit too real. It's easy to imagine someone like John actually harassing a bartender like this after she constantly turns him down, and that makes it a little less easy to laugh at the antics that she has to put up with. The final catalyst in Liz's evolution would thus come when John made its most important change, when it was officially renamed Garfield. This change apparently came at the suggestion of Tom Ryan, who pointed out to Jim that if Garfield was going to get all of the best lines and was going to be the focus of strip after strip, then he was probably the true star. And this one simple change altered almost every aspect of the narrative. If this comic was going to be entirely about the cat from this point forwards, then why did half of the comics feature John going about his day without Garfield? Did every comic now have to feature Garfield? And if that was the case, how would John and Liz's relationship ever be represented? When Jim Davis first previewed Garfield in the Muncie Star, 1 month after the comic left the Pendleton Times, Liz had completed her transformation and was illustrated in an all-white veterinarian uniform. Liz had swiftly moved from lowly bartender to established, successful professional. Insert AOC joke here. Jim had, entirely by accident, made a female character who was actually relatable and three-dimensional. And you know, it's weird. I've never once noticed that in the mainstream Garfield run, Irma and Liz pretty much wear the exact same uniform, simply colored in differently. And it turns out, this is because they both used to work at the same diner, before they were split up for the 1978 reboot. While Liz working at the vet was probably done as an excuse to have Garfield be witness to John's antics, it also added this level of ridiculousness that made the joke land a little better. The idea of John sulking around the house and patiently waiting for Garfield to get sick just so he can rush to this clinic and get shot down in increasingly embarrassing ways is a lot funnier than him stalking the same woman down an alley and harassing her while she's trying to tend bar. One thing is phenomenally clear when one finally is able to read this collection of unseen comics. If it wasn't for this short, 2-year run, Garfield as we know it would not exist. These strips represent a version of the comic that needed to be workshopped for sure, but Pendleton, Indiana gave Jim the chance to do just that. I came to Indiana for just 5 days. But in those 5 days, I had managed to successfully save pages in comic history which no one had seen in over 45 years, alongside seeing exactly the legacy that Garfield continues to have on this community to this very moment. But there was one last thing that I desperately needed to see. Something that would continue to nag at my subconscious if I didn't take, at least, the slightest little peek.
I guess it's this one up here. So, yeah, this is it. Okay, turn left up here. Gotta find somewhere to park.
You've arrived.
Yeah, this is it.
So turn left here?
Yeah.
Where are we going exactly?
Just park along the side. It's the street itself.
Oh, okay.
That's valuable to me. If you'll excuse the car noises. Earlier in this video, I teased that Muncie is supposed to be the town where Garfield is set. Well, a piece of information, a little nugget about Garfield lore, is that the Garfield home, its address in one of the comics, is listed as 711 Maple Street. And this is Maple Street in Muncie, Indiana. So as stupid as it is, theoretically, if Garfield was real, and if Garfield actually took place in the real world, it would take place on this street, Maple Street in Muncie, Indiana. Don't waste your life like I've wasted mine. Find something creative to do other than whatever has led me to this point in my life.
Okay, so it's been a couple months since most of the recording you just saw, and I guess I should bring you guys up to speed on what's happened since then. To put it briefly, the world is ending, and that's not fun. So it's taken me a few months to properly go through all of the comics that I got in Indiana and really restore them to the extent that they deserve. Much of my time has been dedicated to going through the physical and the digital scans and deciding which look better on specific dates, and much to my surprise, there were a lot of them where the printed out copies were superior, but I usually ended up going with the digital scans on most of the dates that I ended up going through. It's probably not accurate to say that it's actually taken me 6 months to do that task, but more that it's taken me 6 months to find time to do that task, because as a YouTuber, I'm an insanely busy man, as you can probably tell by all the content I've been getting out since then. So the description of this video is going to be insane, it's going to be kind of hard to navigate, so I just want to go through it really quickly at the end of this video, so we all know what we're looking at here. I've decided to make the first link in the description a link to the NAACP Defense Fund, because right now in America there's just a lot of injustice going on and it's been pissing me off, and it's kind of been hard to work on this video knowing that this is all happening. So I just want to encourage you guys to donate and try and help innocent people. get the help they need. I expect this video to be a little evergreen. People might find themselves watching it in a year or two. If that's the case, I still stand by this endorsement. I want you guys to support these guys. You know, injustice doesn't go away just because it's not trending on Twitter. And I think it's important that we help out people who are in situations where they don't have help right now. Okay, so that one's really serious. The rest of this is just YouTube-y stuff. There's gonna be a tonal shift. I'm sorry, it's just what's gonna happen. The next link goes to my Twitter. I'm trying to reach a personal goal of 69,000 followers this year. And every click-through helps that, every follow helps us get there. In the next week or so, I'm going to be posting an invitation for people to be in one of my next videos. And I want to see a lot of submissions for that. It'd be fun to have you guys cameo in this video I'm working on. So follow me there if you want to have a chance to be a part of that. The next link goes to my Patreon. Patreon has been amazingly important to me continuing to make YouTube because there have been times in the last 2 years where I just otherwise would not have been able to make a living off of this. You guys who support me on Patreon, that means so much. You really make this channel exist. Finally, we have what all of you guys have been waiting for, and that is links relating to this project. First, you have the Everything PDF. The Everything PDF is exactly what it says in the title. It is everything I found during my research presented in a semi-chronological fashion, so you can go through and read all of this previously lost material. Now, the drawback to the Everything PDF is that it's so big that Google Drive will not let you preview it. If you want to go through that one, you have to download it onto a computer. Notably, there's some stuff in the PDF that I didn't have time to talk about in this video, like there's this weird phone monster that Jim Davis tried to make popular that I have never heard of before, but I found during research. The next link will be everything as PNGs, and you can go through this and browse on Google Drive all of the image files in their natural PNG format. This is great if you want to download these and upload them to wikis, and also if you just can't get, the PDF function to work on your phone. After that, we have a series of PDFs, which are the Everything PDF cut into individual pieces. So we have the Pre-Pendleton collection, which is like high school stuff. Then we have the NormNat collection, and finally we have the John/Garfield collection, and you can go through these individual assortments of comics and just read them. If you're going to open any of these PDFs, I highly recommend finding some software that displays them as the same horizontally, because some of them have different pixel sizes. So for instance, if you open them on Google Drive on desktop, then they're all displayed the same across, and you can go through them, and it's nice and convenient. But if you try and open it on your phone, then it's displayed in this weird fashion that's almost impossible to go through. The last thing in this section is going to be a raw upload of all of the images and PDF scans I made at the different libraries of all these comics. So you're going to be able to go through and look at all the images I saved, and you'll sort of be able to understand all the work I had to put into restoring this stuff and piecing it all together. And if you want to vet my restoration process and try and restore some of these comics yourself, I encourage you to do that. It's all there for you to try. It's in absolutely no sensible order. Good luck trying to figure it out. And the final thing that's going to be in the description is just a list of all the personalities who helped make this video a reality, from the YouTubers who lent their voices for this, to the very talented animator who presented all of these illustrations for my talking points. I encourage you guys follow him on Twitter. Not all of the people who did voices for this video are YouTubers. A lot of them are just people I met on Twitter. In fact, for a role or two in this video, I held sort of open auditions on people who thought they could pull the characters off. So there's another reason to follow me on Twitter. You can just be in a video at some point. Friends are there to help you get started, to give you a push on your way. Friends are there to turn you around, put your feet on the ground for a brand new day. They'll pick you up when you are down, help you swallow your pride with something inside, gonna break on through to the other side. Friends are someone you can open up to when you feel like you're ready to split. When you've got the world on your shoulders, friends are there to give you a tip. Friends are there when you need them. They're even there when you don't. For a while in the dark or shut in the night, friends are there. I don't care, but friends would care for you. Okay, so at this point in the video, there's going to be a bunch of buttons on the screen. If you see a little logo of my face, you'll be able to click that and subscribe. Otherwise, I have included a playlist of all of the Garfield videos that I have made in the past. You can go back through and relive the entire experience from the start. With that, I've been Quinton Reviews. This has been my Quinton Quarantine, and that's all you need.